Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining me for our ongoing series of COVID conversations. In previous videos, we've discussed the topics of mental health, the campus's transition to online learning, keeping fit while at home, and the academic support services that are available on campus. These videos are posted on the college's YouTube channel. April is National Poetry Month, so it's appropriate that I'm joined today by Professor of English Ralph Black, actually one of our most recently promoted professors, so congratulations, Ralph. Ralph has been with us for 20 years, and he says that he was bounced on Isaac Stern's knee as a child, maybe gave him his sense of rhythm. He has published 2 full-length books of poetry and is also one of the co-directors of the Writers' Forum, Brockport's long-running reading series. Thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
So, Ralph, what do you think the place of poetry is in the time of COVID?
I keep thinking about Robert Frost's famous line about poetry as a momentary stay against confusion. And it just seems like such an appropriate sort of way to think about poetry now, as given just how chaotic everything is kind of all around. And also, I think that poetry sort of gives us, it's a sort of an art form that requires you to kind of slow down as a writer, to slow down as a reader, and to pay attention to language in different ways. And given the way that, so much language and so much verbiage is being thrown around these days, some of it, somewhat dubious, poetry seems like a good place to go.
Would you read for us one of the poems that you've selected for today?
Yeah, sure. So, when we talked about doing this, the first poem that came to mind was a poem by William Carlos Williams, the great modernist, who wrote in 1923, published a book-length poem called Spring and All. And it's sort of a mix of sort of modernist experimental poetry, prose and poetry. The first poem proper in that collection. None of the pieces are titled. The first line, the poem is kind of known by the first line, which is "By the road to the contagious hospital," very appropriate, which probably reflects Williams, who was a doctor, medical doctor himself, going to a sort of standalone, hospital unit for tubercular patients. I'm not sure. By the road to the contagious hospital. By the road to the contagious hospital, under the surge of the blue mottled clouds driven from the northeast, a cold wind. Beyond the waste of broad muddy fields, brown with dried weeds, standing and fallen patches of standing water, the scattering of tall trees. All along the road, the reddish, purplish, forked, upstanding, twiggy stuff of bushes and small trees with dead brown leaves under them, leafless vines. Lifeless in appearance, sluggish, dazed spring approaches. They enter the new world naked, cold, uncertain of all, save that they enter. All about them, the cold, familiar wind. Now the grass, tomorrow the stiff curl of wild carrot leaf. One by one, objects are defined. It quickens, clarity, outline of leaf, but now the stark dignity of entrance. Still, the profound change has come upon them. Rooted, they grip down and begin to awaken.
Wow.
It's such a beautiful poem, and particularly for our little corner of Western New York that really has been holding on to winter this year. When everything just seems so beaten down, and we all kind of look into our backyards right now and think, there's no way this is coming back to life. But there's a kind of beautiful hope at the end of that poem that I've always liked.
That was wonderful. Thank you for that. Do you think the poetry can play a role in bringing isolated people together?
I think it's there are a lot of people who are trying to do that. There are lots of organizations that readings are being canceled and book launches are being canceled right and left, and so I'm constantly getting emails and links to poems that, I don't know, perhaps bring some solace or some sense of, solid ground to us in uncertain times. And I think that um, poems and writers just in general are sort of coming together to create some kind of community, because it's a pretty lonely, isolated business under the best of circumstances. And so now, you hear from a lot of writers who say, well, my life isn't actually all that different. I tend to lock myself away as much as possible anyway. This is a fairly extreme example of it, but I think that there's a way that these poems can um, be sort of passed back and forth, and I think that's happening a lot.
That's wonderful. Perhaps another poem.
So I came across this poem the other day, wonderful 20th century poet whose work I love, Liesel Mueller, and there's something about just the imaginative act of transformation that happens in this poem that seems sort of in keeping with the way that at least my brain has been sort of working a little bit. It's called Things. What happened is we grew lonely living among the things. So we gave the clock a face, the chair a back, the table 4 stout legs, which will never suffer fatigue. We fitted our shoes with tongues as smooth as our own and hung tongues inside bells so we could listen to their emotional language. Because we loved graceful profiles, the pitcher received a lip, the bottle a long, slender neck. Even what was beyond us was recast in our image. We gave the country a heart, the storm an eye, the cave a mouth, so we could pass into safety.
I think there's something so incredibly evocative about that poem, how it embodies so much and evokes so much at the same time. It is truly beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I agree. And the ending especially
Mhm.
really resonant to where and how we're living now. But the power of metaphor, I mean, the literalness of the transformative work of metaphor in the poem, I think is gorgeous.
Speaking of where we're living now, how do you think poets will document these times?
Uh, I think poets will document these times the way that poets document most times, which I think when we're lucky, I think it's most successful when we think small, when we pay attention to little flashes, and I've just noticed myself just walking around the neighborhood and trying to get some air and some exercise that so one of the things that I'm noticing is, because everybody's at home, I'm noticing kids much more than I ever did, and they're outside. A couple of weeks ago, I was walking the dog around the neighborhood, and there were 3 young kids playing. This is after a rain. They were in the gutter, in the street, with a bucket, scooping up muddy water and dumping it on each other and just cackling wildly. And I just thought, how long has it been since anybody has seen that? I think that maybe because so much of the work now is online and everybody's spending hours and hours staring at a screen, that when they get the opportunity to break away from the screen, running out playing in the mud seems like the logical thing to do. So I think that's pretty lovely.
I wonder if you could close out with a poem of your own for us.
Sure. So I've been finding myself probably against most people's better judgment writing about I guess writing about this kind of pandemic, quarantine life, thinking a lot about Emily Dickinson and how much she was sort of just kind of stayed in her room doing her work and kind of looking out the window, and that led to this poem um, that I wrote last week called Dickinson in Quarantine. And the first 2 lines sort of play off the opening lines of one of her poems. Silence is taught by sound, repetition by singular saying. I re-say words for the pebble trails they form along my tongue, rolling, smaller than moons but equally lucid. Their cadence shows me a way to move. I try to give silence room to move as it stays in place, braiding grass, unspooling thread through rooms where even now you could be sitting, transposing silence as it whirs up spores like words, like leaves cut loose in a conical wind. I can't remember how this got started, what country of what language first posed a question, or how an answer sparked through city blocks and grasslands. Shepherds call to their flocks and herds. Neighbors pass folk tunes and home remedies to neighbors over the fence, through the hedgerow, match to striker, flint to stone. How quickly every thread becomes a fuse as the streets empty out and the skies grow wildly blue. Down the block, a pair of robins nod and preen, unbewildered on the unflowered branch of what won't be a cherry tree until its flowers flute and trill like the robins, their animating notes received and passed along, as they've always been, with or without our gratitude.
How every thread becomes a fuse. What a wonderful image. Thank you for sharing that with us today. I'm
Sure.
so
Yeah.
pleased that you had the opportunity to join us, that we can celebrate National Poetry Month, and that we can hear words from our very own professors that are speaking to these times and giving us hope in these difficult days. So thank you so much for joining us. For
Pleasure.
those who are watching, I hope you have found this conversation interesting, helpful, evocative. If you have ideas for future conversations that would benefit our community, please email me at president@brockport.edu. Stay well.